SAW.EARTH is an architecture and building workshop founded by Seskunas that stands by the idea that building with the materials you design with makes one a more inventive architect. The studio has successfully delivered projects and design and build workshops in kinetic, industrial, and architectural designs around New York City. And today we are joined by Drew himself to chat around the topic of designing for transformation. So we're excited to have you here, Drew.
Thanks for having me.
Excited for our conversation. So will you first tell us about your background and about the firm?
Sure. I grew up in the suburbs of Baltimore City on the East Coast of the U.S. And it was like some parts of it were great. Like I grew up, I had like a forest across the street from my house, but there are other parts were pretty standard suburban sprawl, like strip malls everywhere, and you had to drive if you wanted to go to the grocery store. Like when I was in high school, used to hang out in the parking lot of the McDonald's. So, I was always envious of like cities and urban areas. I remember being really jealous of kids that got to ride their bike to school. So when I you know, became college age, I really wanted to move into urban environments and to explore that more. I was really just obsessed with that level of architecture. So, throughout my 20s, I lived in Washington, D.C., in New York City, and then lived in various cities in Europe. And to me, I was attracted to architecture because it just seemed like such an efficient profession to have. Like, when you're living and you're just like walking around, you're absorbing architecture in the built environment all the time, and you're using it, you're constantly using it. So by doing that, you're kind of collecting data to get better at it all the time. So you just have to pay closer attention to what's around you, and you would become better at it. So it just seemed like a profession that I could do for my whole life, and as I lived, I could become better at it. Um, so I worked in kind of various traditional architectural capacities in Washington, D.C., and New York, and then I was fortunate to work for an artist in Europe who was getting some kind of larger architectural commissions. And in my late 20s, I worked on a really large urban project in Berlin, in the western part of the city, where I was the design architect and had a lot of freedom. It's called Bikini Berlin, and it was this huge. We were doing a historic renovation, kind of preservation of these existing buildings, but then adding a large component to it as well in a big public park. And it was a really exciting project. It was kind of everything that I'd always wanted to do, and felt very fortunate to be able to working on it at that age. But there were kind of all these limitations around me because of the scale of the project. We were, even though we were design architects and we were given a lot of freedom, we were kind of siloed from I think the final process. You in a project that big, you have to get city approval, preservation approval. The mayor was involved. All these stakeholders are there, and they kind of, I think, limit your ability to experiment and to really push the design to make it unique and relevant to that part of the city, that part of Germany, people interested in projects like that. So I kind of, at the end of that project, I was very proud. I still am very proud of it. It's been built, and every time I visit it, I'm very proud of it. But I see a lot of mistakes in it too, because I think we did a design, and then like 5 years later, it was built. So when that project was over, I really wanted to go back, or well, one, I wanted to start my own studio. I wanted to move back to New York, and wanted to get more involved in the parts of the experimental, the prototyping, the building of projects, because I felt like if I could access that, then I could be more efficient in how I design and more effective. I could make work that would be relevant because I could be testing it as I'm doing it. So that was how I created the workshop here. And the scale is much smaller that I work at now and more manageable. But it allows us a lot more freedom, and it allows us to kind of do things that are far more complex than you would typically do. When you're working at a scale like that, or most architects, because of the risk involved, like the monetary risk, safety risks, all those things, like they kind of default to standardized things. So that's why the built environment that we see is like a lot of it's pretty standardized and not unique, especially as years go by, you can travel to cities throughout the world, and you kind of start to see the same materials, the same design elements, things like that get propagated throughout. And I think that that's, you know, we're losing a lot because of that. We're losing the unique nature of our cities, the unique nature of specific places. So for me, like most of our work, because we have this capacity to fabricate or prototype or experiment with robotics, then we can design things that are truly unique to the specific task or the client or the location.
That's amazing. So, yeah, I think you kind of touched upon what inspired the design approach, but I know you also do a lot of design and build workshops in the city. So how would you describe the thought process behind it?
So that kind of came about. This is the fifth year that we're doing it. I was teaching at New York Institute of Technology, and they had just developed a Master of Architecture program. So the director of that program, David Diamond, who's just a fantastic person, and the dean, Maria Pervolini, she both were very supportive in having me develop something new for that program, because they wanted to take it in a direction that most architecture programs in the city hadn't gone to yet. And because I have this kind of experience between like the traditional world of architecture of just like designing at a computer, but also fabricating, I was really interested in integrating the idea of giving students access to building work. So that I've seen it help my practice so much. I think that it's great to give students really early on that opportunity, so they don't. I think the further away you get from your schooling, the harder it is to get back in touch with that. And then also, I think what was really important was like there are all these schools of architecture in New York City, but they don't really have a lot of direct contact with the citizens of the city, like the specific neighborhoods and people. I wouldn't say that like most people in normal neighborhoods in New York City feel like they're connected to the architecture scene as a whole, right? And I think that that's a shame, because I think that like as an architect, you should be thinking about how you're serving your community specifically in the city that you live in. You know, it's not even though like I would definitely admit like I think I, like a lot of people, were attracted to the like traditional archetype of what an architect is, like this kind of like Frank Lloyd Wright, like cape wearing person who's like directing like the way that the world works and making these skyscrapers. And that's just like a very ego driven sensibility. I think the reality of being an architect is, you know, you're a professional in your community and you have an expertise, and you owe it to your community to be able to serve them specifically. So I wanted to kind of instill in young architecture students that idea of civic pride, that they could take their knowledge and then go back and work directly with the community that they were, you know, studying within, and then create like a permanent object. Because that's the other side too, is that most design build workshops, if not all of them, are temporary projects. So they like, you know, the students will do it, they'll have a great experience building it, but most of that material doesn't really get recycled into anything, and it doesn't have a long-term effect for the community that's surrounding it. So I really wanted to be able to create permanent work so that students would be able to, you know, for one, like be able to see how it affected that community over a long term, not just when it was built, but like in um the years that followed. Like, was it useful? Like, did it help them? How did it help them? What were the ideas that we anticipated? Did they work out, or were there other things that we didn't anticipate that came up too? So they could understand the kind of time scale of their work as well. That like as an architect, not, you know, when you're finished designing it or when it's built, that's not when your job is done. You need to go back and visit your projects and see how have they aged. Like, do people use them in the way that you intended? And if not, like how can you alter how you design work to better accommodate that in the future?
So, what is being an inventive architect to you, and how does actively participating in the construction process, with the materials that you design with, impact your approach to work?
I think like being an inventive architect means, well, like architecture generally is not an accessible thing for people. You know, most people who hire architects are wealthy. So the kind of vast middle class doesn't really often get a chance to work with architects. Design in general, especially in America, is not an accessible thing economically. Um, and I, as someone who grew up like in a kind of middle class suburban surrounding where very few people that I knew growing up had ever hired an architect for anything, um, I I struggled with like getting projects built. So when you're a young architect, you have to like be inventive. People don't have a lot of money, right? So you have to figure out how you can get a design built or get something for them made that's interesting and that's beneficial to them on a small budget. And I think that's carried over because now I have, access to wealthier clients, but I want to work with people that need architecture that might not be able to afford it. So by being inventive with how I use my materials or how you apply them across a structure, for instance. So like a specific thing would be like if I can use a thinner gauge piece of metal to create a structure, I'm using less material. It's a far more efficient usage of that material. I can save the client money. I can build a bigger, more elaborate structure that can serve them better. And then I can also anticipate like what's the value of this structure after it's been used too? Can it be broken down and be reused into something else? And then another part would be something that I'm really interested in is like kinetics and how that integrates into architecture. So you have multi-uses. So instead of building two things that have a single use, how can I build one thing that serves both of those uses or all the things in between that? So I think that is a way to just basically essentially make design as accessible as possible to as many people. And that's the most inventive way you can be as an architect, I think.
That's beautiful. How has your experiences in directing design and build workshops in your city shape your view on the role of architecture in community development? Although, yeah, I know it might sound repetitive, but if you want to elaborate more on it.
Oh, of course. I love to talk about this stuff. Come on. Yeah, I think I had done a few workshops before, and before I started doing this series, but I hadn't worked directly with community groups, and that's always been very interesting. We've been really lucky. We've worked with a number of different organizations, but the one that we've worked with most consistently is called the New York Restoration Project. It was a nonprofit started by the actress Bette Midler to kind of preserve green space throughout the city. So there are some of the administrators there who've been really successful in linking us and working directly with me and being linked with community groups that have that would be good pairings for our groups of students because it's like you have to be open-minded. There's a lot of people that need to kind of benefit from it, and my role is to make sure that everybody involved is happy. The community group needs to get something that's beneficial and useful to them. The students need to learn something new and have a unique experience that benefits them. And then, the institute, which is funding it, they need to get something as well out of it, right? It's not just enough for them to kind of satisfy those things. They need some type of visual representation that they can promote to bring more students to the school as well. So as much as like it's amazing to just know that you've done good work, that people appreciate it, you have to know that like doing one project's not enough. You've got to be able to keep this going in the future. And to keep it going in the future, you have to satisfy all of those stakeholders. So that's part of it. And then, making sure that the community group is satisfied is difficult. They're like some of these gardens are like 50 member, 75 member gardens, and they have, they might have been started in the late 80s, and there might be one or two people that have kind of stayed consistently throughout that time. But because it's New York City, there's a lot of transients in these neighborhoods. A lot of them are going through gentrification too. So you have that balance that's occurring within the community garden itself. Some of them are very cohesive. Some of them aren't as cohesive, and sometimes our projects become, a representation of the friction between those two elements. What we always try to do is do some type of analysis, like a historical analysis of what the culture of this neighborhood is and how that affects these places as community spaces. So like one of the most recent ones that we finished this past September was in East Harlem, which is like a really heavily Puerto Rican neighborhood. And that idea of Puerto Rican pride is like very evident when you walk into the garden into the neighborhood. You realize how important it is. And the students did a lot of research on that, and they've uncovered things that they really weren't aware of. Like, you see a lot of Puerto Rican flags around, and you just sort of chalk it up to like people being proud that they're Puerto Rican. But if you do that research, then the students learn, oh, well, in fact, the United States banned the Puerto Rican flag for like 80 years. And if you were in Puerto Rico and you're occupied by the United States and you flew the flag, it was a symbol of, they were kind of, that was something that could get you thrown in jail, basically. Any symbols of national identity or pride were banned by the United States, which is something that most, young Americans don't really see or understand in that sense. So to get that, for them, that puts that idea of identity in place into context, and it helps them be more sympathetic when they approach a specific community group.
Yeah, I actually had some of the talks earlier said that, architects are essentially a mediator of the many stakeholders. So it really reminds me of that.
I couldn't agree more. You're facilitating, like, and you have to be honest about it. Like, you have to be honest what you want to get out of it too. Like, I also have goals. I have an agenda, and I have ideas that I want to see executed as well. And I try to be honest with everybody, because I think that that's the best way to kind of to keep everybody satisfied and to make good work, right? If you only fulfill your own goals, or you only fulfill one part of the team's goals, then the project's going to be lacking as a result, and it's just not going to have as long of a lifespan. You're going to, be wasting those materials, that time, and that funding, and then potential new opportunities that could have came from it.
I agree. So now will you share with us about the OCA project on Roosevelt Island? About what did you try to achieve through the design, and how was it perceived by the public?
Oh, sure. So the OCO project was completed in, I think that was our third pavilion that we designed, and it was we were working with a school called the Child School on Roosevelt Island, which is a school for children like kindergarten through, I think they have middle school and high school actually, but mainly that was the elementary school area for kids with learning difficulties. And at the time, I was having my students read a book by the Finnish architect Juhani Palaasma called Eyes of the Skin, which is like a really, famous kind of treatise on the perception of architecture. I think how people absorb it. So specifically, he talks about how humans, like our culture generally, is very visually dominant. So we focus on things that we see. And as a result, a lot of the things that the terms we use or the design that we create is heavily focused on that. So for instance, like when you say that you understand what somebody else is saying, you might say, oh, I see you, right? I see what you're saying. As opposed, you wouldn't say like, I taste what you're saying. We don't prioritize the sense of taste. We prioritize the sense of sight. So like, if something is like, if something is comprehensive, it's clear, right? It's not like we always put things in terms of that. But as a result of prioritizing the visual, we kind of have lost all the other senses. And that doesn't mean that we don't sense them, right? When we're in spaces, we're always smelling them and feeling them and hearing them. All those other senses we're responding to them, but architects have lost out because they prioritize the sense of the visual. So we wanted to create a space because we're making an outdoor reading room for students who had learning difficulties. We thought, well, why not focus this space on the other senses, and kind of, instead of prioritizing the visual, we'll prioritize the sense of smell and the sense of touch and the sense of hearing. So the space is actually on like a little grassy knoll within a courtyard that was designed by the architect Jose Luis on Roosevelt Island. So it overlooks the East River. So you have this kind of sound of the river going by. And we focused on using really tactile materials that would change over time. So we used cedar wood, bamboo, and Corten steel. So those materials, they age and they develop a patina, and they have very specific scents to cedar, and then we use linseed oil to seal the bamboo. And the idea was to kind of create a space that when you went into it, you were enveloped with all these things. You became more in touch with all the other senses that you haven't prioritized. And then as a result, you kind of were more able to focus and more able to concentrate on things.
So lastly, how do you approach upcoming challenges, focusing on transformative approach to design and also adapting to the evolving needs of the community?
I just wait for whatever, like, I guess we're looking for whatever ideas kind of come up or issues come up. So like we're starting our next, we're starting to work with our next community group, which is a community group in Bushwick. And it's that like a kind of the garden has a heavy Bengali population who grow these hanging beans, and they asked us if we could design for them a kind of vertical growing structure that can help facilitate it because they do a lot of food outreach in their neighborhood. So they have like kind of they're sort of like a community distributor of food to people in need. So that I think will be like a new challenge for us. I definitely have designed some vertical greenery systems before. I wouldn't say that I have a green thumb, but I think for us, like we're always looking to expand our knowledge as it pertains to architecture and as it pertains to the built environment. So like when we see something like this, it's exciting because we're like, oh, this is an opportunity for us to learn about that as well, and to learn about, how do these plants grow, and how can we more use our design sensibilities to more effectively implement these ideas. So it's just kind of trying to stay open-minded and try to kind of take on these challenges as we go on and as we expand. I was really lucky that I continue to get a lot of support from NYIT's Graduate School of Architecture for the project, so that we've expanded the class, and I was able to hire a former student who was in the first year that we did this, and he's since graduated, but now I brought him on and he's going to be co-teaching the class with me. So I think that like just taking on as many new challenges as possible is the best way to proceed.
That's good. So yeah, I really appreciate your sharing today, and we're really inspired by, your philosophy of wanting to be in touch with not only the conceptualizing and the designing aspect, but also the construction, the building aspect, and even further, right? The post-occupancy evaluation, you go back to the place, see how it's being used and what can you do to improve it. It's always nice to see your works evolve, and also appreciate how you build workshops with the community, and it really highlights how architects are facilitators of the many different needs and stakeholders, which essentially is a hard job, but it's when you can pull them all together, then it's really, really rewarding. So thank you so much for sharing today.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.